Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Kaylee McNamara. Well, welcome everyone to another episode of the Ending Sexploitation podcast. Very glad to be joined today by Dr. Marcel Vanderwatt, our president and CEO at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Hi, Marcel. Thanks for coming back.
Great to be here, Hailey. Love the podcast and doing a great job.
Oh, we're having a lot of fun, and I'm glad to be able to talk with you again. Last time we were going over kind of your background and a lot of the expertise that you've brought to Nkosi and the work that we're doing. And there's another angle now that I think we can dig deeper on that really does incorporate a lot of your firsthand experience, and that's the issue of sextortion. Now, those who've been following the podcast really closely might remember that we've talked about sextortion here or there in the past. A quick reminder for everyone that sextortion really is the threatening of any person with the release of sexual imagery that you might post it online or send it to their families or to their coworkers. And it could be in exchange of anything of value, right? So that could be money, typically what people think about, but it could also be extortion for things like for child sexual abuse materials or further offline abuse. It could be a lot of different things. This issue of sextortion, Marcel, I think is one that people see in the news a lot recently. There have been so many really tragic cases of teenagers who've been targeted with sextortion and who've unfortunately even died by suicide as a result. So it's kind of looming large in the headlines. And obviously it can be done, the perpetrators of this crime can be individuals, whether sex traffickers, an ex-partner, but can also be done by an organized criminal network. So I think that's where your expertise particularly really comes in. Just high level first thoughts, Marcel, on the topic of sextortion and how it's just so relevant today.
Yeah, pervasive, and I think it's exploding for a variety of reasons, but it's not new. I've worked with these kind of cases back in a day when that word didn't even really exist. And back then, you would use words like extortion or blackmail, but in person, what that would look like, I've investigated syndicates where a very typical modus operandi is they would have a trafficked victim, and then the victim would then bring a sex buyer into a hotel room. And very often these groups, because of their syndicated nature, they would often target prominent individuals. These could be politicians, these could even be law enforcement officials. So when they have the ideal client, or the sex buyer, but somebody that you would be lured into a place by a victim, they would be in the room, and as soon as that person enters, they would force the sex buyer or the politician or the law enforcement officer to do compromising actions, whether it's on the survivor or the victim or on them, and that would be recorded, and that footage would then be used to blackmail or extort a official. And very often it's not just money, but it's also access to sensitive information, sensitive systems within government, and I'm talking about 20 years ago already. So I think the mercurial nature of the internet, and the fact that you now don't have to be in a specific geographical location to get access to information systems really makes extortion just such a viable, a natural entry point to get access to information and money. So yes, it's not new. I just think obviously now with the internet, and we also know how groups on the African continent play such a big part in targeting US teens, but we also know adults are not are also targeted by these groups.
Yes, and there's so much to unpack here. But
Yeah.
that is so fascinating that it is a long-standing
Yeah,
problem, and it's something that criminal networks have used
yeah.
for a long period of time, and it's almost just like the internet's democratized it now.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
think what we also know, and, recently or constantly being in touch with informer networks, really all around the world, I'm still in touch with many people, but is that sextortion, romance scams, 419 scams, which is more on the fraud side of things, but also BC crimes, which are business, compromising emails.
Mhm.
For many of these groups, that's the easy entry point, so you have these groups often recruiting new entrants to the syndicate, and they would often play around with those crimes and kind of honing their skills, and in that way finding their way up into the ladder. So in that way, sextortion as a crime has just been, a focal point for
Mhm.
so many of these syndicates. And the US is a very legitimate target. We know a lot of these groups have a footprint in the United States. The US dollar still have a lot of currency. So yeah, the US is an ideal target, not just teens, but adults, but also the elderly, right?
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah, and what's so interesting there too is you drawing the line between this and romance scams and the business and the defrauding of elderly people,
Yeah,
which I think all of these issues have come across people's radars. I feel like I get spam
exactly.
texts, constantly, and I just kind of know enough to not respond and to
Yeah.
block and report it. But recognizing that these things aren't happening in a vacuum
No.
and that they're very often being conducted by an organized criminal network, and whether you're targeted for a business compromise or your
Mm,
parent is being targeted for financial crime, sextortionists are within that network as well.
absolutely.
And I think when
Yeah.
we talk about sextortion as an organized crime, of course, recognizing it can be done by individuals, it is done by individuals.
Mm,
Organized crime, I think, also has a lot of different layers to it. And I feel like
mm,
sextortion exists on pretty much all those layers. I mean, I could very easily see, I don't know very much about it, but like a local gang, like maybe
mm,
taking place, being involved in that. But I know a lot of your expertise is the transnational
mm,
organized crime element.
mm,
And specifically because of your South African background, you have more knowledge about
mm,
how the organized criminal element that is on the African continent that then targets
mm,
victims internationally. Could you
mm,
just tell me a little bit more about that, this transnational
mm.
element and what that looks like?
Yeah, and I think another point is that these groups are, when you think about organized crime and you think about a criminal group, I've worked very specifically with a lot of West African syndicates, very specifically Nigerian syndicates, but also just the nature of South Africa. I mean, you've got Eastern European group, Bulgarian,
Mm,
Russian. These activities are very well documented. Chinese criminal networks, but all of them are involved with what they call polycriminal activities. So it's not just human trafficking or sex trafficking, but there's also endangered species. There's
mm,
also precious metals, and so these groups, based on their structure internally, but also their loosely connected nature with each other, they all always try and in one way, shape, or form, where possible, collaborate,
mm,
right? And so I know for a fact that on the African continent, where there's some form of collaboration around some of these activities between the Chinese and the Nigerian criminal networks, um, but yeah, again, the interface or what the internet allows these groups to have access to is just beyond our imagination. I think um, the fact that we have US teens and we know pornography and the entry point of pornography at such a young age, these groups know that. I
mm,
mean, they study these criminal activities. They know how to access these populations, and yeah, so it really is effectively an organized crime. I don't think sextortion in and of itself is organized crime. It's just really one of those pipelines that they
mhm,
kind of dip their toe in. And you've got people that are experts, on some of these activities. But I mean, some of these groups, they have memberships, they
mm,
have bylaws, they have rules, they have
mhm,
ways in which they keep order within their structures. We know that some of these groups, like the Black Axe on the
Mhm.
African continent, are known as an ultra violent group. So, again, they just it's just very mercurial and very opportunistic as
Mhm.
well. So, yeah.
And it's interesting too how, because we talk all the time at Nkosi about how different forms of sexual abuse and
Yeah.
exploitation are interlinked. So sextortion does not exist in a vacuum. It is
Mm,
connected, like you said, with kind of the normalization of pornography makes someone maybe more susceptible to
mm,
being extorted because they are kind of used to that idea of
mm,
maybe being solicited or being sent content. But also, we know that sextortion is sometimes used to perpetuate gathering child sexual abuse materials if
mm,
they're trying to get that from a child, or to extort someone into further sex trafficking or into
mm.
offline child sexual
Yeah.
abuse. But then there's, like you said, there's even more dots that we could connect outside of the
So
sexual
many.
exploitation space to the criminal organized
So
space.
many. Yeah, I'll just read, and I know we'll put this up on the
Mhm.
screen, but last week, or was it on Monday, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, they released the annual study. And they're just the one piece, and I'm reading specifically from the United States
Mm,
report on this, in this, the report, just a section on cyber dependent crimes. I'm just going to read this. It says the US cyber dependent crime market is a major threat, impacting critical infrastructure such as healthcare, finance, transportation, and defense. Cyber attacks, including ransomware, malware, and data breaches, result in billions in losses. Foreign groups, primarily Russia and China, play
mm,
a key role employing sophisticated hacking strategies and mainly targeting government infrastructure,
mm,
financial institutions, and private corporations. Then they highlight the 2024 Treasury breach here, and they talk about the vulnerabilities in third-party cybersecurity. Despite federal task forces combating cybercrime, challenges persist due to its evolving nature, placing the US among top global cyber dependent crime markets. Now, if we just look at the Russia and the China mentioned there, and knowing how prominent, like very prominent, these two groups are in South Africa and in Southern Africa and in West Africa, you cannot but urge people to be alert
mm,
that, these crimes, the things that we're talking about here, these cyber attacks, that's one dimension to it.
mm,
Sextortion is such an easy, low hanging fruit that these groups tap into. We know, I think there's 120 reasons why we know why US teens are targeted. I would argue there's probably the same number of reasons why we don't know about adults and the elderly being targeted because of the shame, because of
yeah.
the stigma involved, in being sharing intimate images if you are in a marriage,
Mhm,
so people, I've spoken to some people more recently, people working in the field in South Africa, including people of HSI and other entities that's based in Pretoria, and they speak about the unbelievable emotional and spiritual harm that people face. Imagine being a nurse,
mhm,
and you are being scammed into a romance scam, but then being sextorted because you've shared these intimate images and losing your entire retirement savings.
mm,
These
mhm.
are very real cases happening. These are adults, and we don't often hear about these adults. So I think there's an enormous dark number of adult victims that are falling victim to sextortion, not just internationally, but obviously locally.
And
Yeah.
it and that's such an important point too, because when you think about this, the organized criminal element to
Mm,
this, of course, children, for the purposes of collecting CSAM, makes
yeah.
absolute sense to target them, and they're so vulnerable,
Mm,
to any kind of manipulation. But adults, if you're looking for money, you
mm.
know, adults are the primary
Exactly.
target.
Exactly. It never stops with the money. I
Yeah.
mean, the thing is with these guys, I mean, I've worked with so many of them. I'll tell you recently the example 2017, I was sitting in a in a place with it was a Nigerian trafficker, and he shared with me 75 profiles that he's busy working on. I'm busy working on these people. And again, social engineering. These guys are incredibly good with social engineering, kind of creating different stories and narratives to manipulate people. And these are
Mhm.
both adults and children. But just the example of an adult, imagine being able to get your hands on a adult US federal worker that
Mhm.
is strategically positioned. It could be Treasury. We saw the Treasury cyber attack here. It could be anybody. It could be Department of Defense, somebody working at the Pentagon, regularly screening, regularly browsing pornography. And here you have somebody that say, hey, share intimate images. And this is ostensibly a beautiful woman elsewhere in the world, you're sharing those images, you're compromised.
Yeah.
Firstly, they're going to go after your money. If your money is up, they are going to see what they can get. They know where you work and what
Mhm.
you've got access to. And the next thing is information, sensitive information. We also know in this report they talk about corruption.
Yeah.
That low-level law enforcement corruption is very real. So when you look at the confluence of a compromise on a personal, private level, sharing intimate images, but knowing that you are a federal employee, I think the opportunities for these criminal groups are endless. And pornography, again, I would argue, and we've had this conversation, now more than ever, we have to recognize pornography is a national security threat.
Mhm.
It's an entry point. That's the Achilles heel, of, I guess, if you want to use the argument that from a human nature perspective, from that angle, where they compromise. And I think it's a national security threat. And that's the angle that they use and pursue to get money, but also data breaches.
Yeah.
Very real.
It's just have not heard people talk about this angle, at least in a very public way, of the
No.
national security threat that sextortion makes. I think the public, we're just now catching up to, okay, what is sextortion and the fact that it's targeting children. And I think that's been what's really been covered
Mm,
in the media. This national security angle is
yeah.
really alarming when you think about it, because, like you said, it is this perfect item that someone will feel shrouded in shame. They won't want
Mm.
to maybe whether break up their marriage or lose maybe a security clearance or what have you, and it
Mm.
just gives so much
Yeah,
leverage.
well, I mean, it's
Yeah.
these are such logical, intuitive arguments. If you think about 20 years ago, the people that I investigated then and how they went
Mhm.
about targeting very specific, high-profile people like judges.
Mhm.
I've situations, so many situations of judges being compromised, very specifically targeted by a person exploited in prostitution, being lured to a location, the judge going into the room, and then you've got these three guys, baseball bat, metaphorically, symbolically speaking, and you know, very compromising footage being recorded.
Mhm.
Now, I mean, I would. That's another thing we need to start looking into. If you have, um, you know, people strategically positioned in our courts, in our criminal justice system, politicians, you know, judges,
Mhm.
who are at the helm of making very critical decisions in court cases. These are people that would naturally be targeted by
Mhm.
these groups, in compromising decisions in our courts. These are not some abstract theoretical arguments.
Mhm.
These are very real world scenarios that I know personally has played out elsewhere. I don't know yet of a situation locally where a judge has been compromised because him or her has been sextorted. But these are very real scenarios that we need to keep on our radar. And yeah, national security threat and a threat to our rule of law locally,
Mhm.
really.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking through kind of next steps,
Mm,
solutions, what's needed to change. I think it's such a multifaceted issue. The answer
mm,
has to be multifaceted. I
mm,
just, from my background, start looking at the tech companies. I start thinking about
mm,
the online platforms. What more can they be doing? I think they could be doing so much more, for example, especially around minors. I do think that's where they have a lot more that they could be doing, preventing some individual from sending nude imagery to a minor,
Mm,
preventing minors from sending CSAM out, or even preventing adult strangers from contacting children. Some of these are
mm,
like product design
mm.
steps that I think could be taken. I'm curious for your thoughts either on the online platform side or other things that you think could be done that would maybe help target the criminal organized element of
Yeah.
this.
Well, I think again, it's really giving pornography the attention that it really needs.
Mhm.
I think this conversation needs to move from the first level of the elevator right to the top level, and saying, you know what, no longer can we walk on eggshells from a discursive debates and freedom of speech perspective. It's a very, very real threat. I mean,
Mhm.
Nkosi has been long standing in our position on the public health risks and harms around pornography. I mean, we've done the work in the SCOTUS matter about what
Mhm.
pornography does in terms of children. Now we need to elevate this from an to a national security issue. And I think part of that is, I mean, in 2019 there was this research study that was done on the issue of pornography and its implication in the business environment
Mm.
and ethics, and the link between unethical business decisions and pornography viewing. So I think there, from a US, from a corporate perspective, is rethinking our policies
Mhm.
just on something as basic as how corporate resources are being used on a pornography
Mhm.
perspective. And then obviously Nkosi, our work around CDA 230, and really holding big tech accountable for how they enable and perpetuate and allow these groups directly, indirectly, wittingly, unwittingly, to perpetrate these crimes. So I think it's important that we not only, connect the dots, we first have to collect the
Mm.
dots and then connect them. But there's a very strong argument to really elevate this issue of
Mhm.
pornography to a much higher level. Yeah.
Absolutely. Taking it so seriously, I
Yeah.
think, is such a missing element, and is so vital for coming up with real creative solutions and
Yeah.
meaningful solutions. What I mean,
Yeah.
so you have had this personal experience of investigating or being very aware of these criminal syndicates that are perpetuating sextortion. If you
Mm,
just had a magic wand, Marcel, what
mm,
would you do to, because I think there's always going to be individuals who
mm.
use this tactic for ill-gotten gains, but for the organized criminal element, that is very alarming, obviously, for this national security threat,
Mm,
just how much more efficient it can be.
mm,
Um, okay, I'm going to ask you for your magic wand. What would
mm.
you do? But actually, before we even hop into that, could you just tell me a little bit more? You were telling me about how some of these extortionists have started using AI
Yeah,
chatbots even
yeah, yeah.
to
There
scale.
there is some cases on the African continent now, and where those cases are linked to so many countries elsewhere in the world, where you've got one bad actor, a human actor, employs chatbots to try and engage possible victims. And as soon as those victims engage with these chatbots, then the bad actor, the human actor, would jump into that loop and actually drive that conversation over the edge to a full-blown exploitation case. So
Mhm.
so absolutely. I
Mhm.
mean, it's not like, I mean, it's disingenuous to think that corporate America, corporations across the globe are starting to inculcate artificial intelligence. I think I'm speaking under correction. There's this one statistic where CEOs say, and there's been research done among CEOs, that more than 90% of them say that they're going to start using AI in their
Mhm.
business. Well, surely, that the criminal market and bad actors out there are thinking the same, and they
Mhm.
are doing it, and they are using artificial intelligence already to scale their operations, and they are doing so very, very effectively.
Mhm.
And I do think, again, you and I, we've had a conversation previously about how do we create a system that looks remarkably similar to the criminal networks that perpetrate these crimes. So the thing is to start thinking, how do we think like they do, and how do we employ these tactics? So there's a variety of asymmetrical tactics that can be used very effectively to disrupt what these guys are doing, and it's to use artificial intelligence. It could be along the lines of AI flooding. It could be,
And what does
embedding.
that mean? So AI flooding.
Yeah, so what that could look like, I mean, that is like this individual is using AI chatbots to engage unsuspecting victims and try and target and create some contact there. It could be the use of artificial intelligence chatbots to just flood their platforms and their markets. I mean, often these groups, especially the ones I've worked with on the African continent, they refer to these as hustle kingdoms. So you've got multiple actors. Some of them sit in cybercrime or cyber markets, and like the Yahoo boys behind the computer, and they operate on specific websites where they try and target unsuspecting victims. So it's really flooding those markets where they are active with bots that are programmed and are coded to essentially disrupt what they do. I also know that many of these groups that are very prolific in sextortion, targeting US teens and US citizens, that there's also cosmology there and a modus operandi that is very predisposed to paranoia. And there's certain belief systems, and we've spoken about juju and animist rituals that some of these guys are involved in. So paranoia can easily be sown by using chatbots that just disinform and misinform these groups, and you really disrupt what they do. So there's just, I just think it's thinking out of the box, and these are what these asymmetrical tactics could look like to address them. But it's really, yeah, just throwing them off their off the systems
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
they use. So
What would you think about I think we've also discussed the ideas of trying to hack some of these groups. I guess that could probably also feed into
yeah.
paranoia, really just trying to sow, they're organized crime. Let's try to make them as
Exactly,
disorganized as
and to
possible.
disrupt it as
Yeah.
much as possible. Again, you looking and studying the tactics that they use, and using the same tactics really against them, but also using artificial intelligence. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we've previously spoken how artificial intelligence has really poured rocket fuel on conventional, traditional sexual exploitation, and the methods used to perpetrate that. So conversely, we can use those same systems and technologies to disrupt and curtail and to deter what they are doing. But conversely, artificial intelligence really gives us the capacity to record and to document these cases so that we can ultimately hold them accountable, and to create prosecutable crimes. And there's obviously, mutual legal assistance agreements between the US and many African countries. So there's no reason why we can't employ these
Mm-hmm.
methods. Yeah.
What would you say to someone who is concerned about this issue? Maybe two questions. What would you say to someone who maybe is being sextorted right now? Statistics. There is one study from 2024 that did a survey of, I think, around 16,000 people from 10 different countries that said 1 in 7 adults have been threatened with the release of
Yeah.
sexual images. And that's likely incredibly underreported, for all the reasons that we were talking about earlier. So it's ostensibly possible that there are people who have been or will experience
Oh, yeah.
sextortion who are listening. What would you say to them?
Just on the scope and the prevalence of this is, we know that there's been this 150% increase in the issue of sextortion. I think that was between 2023 and
Mm,
2024.
mhm,
Some of the NCMEC statistics there. Just in the last couple of months, I've personally received 3 phone
mm,
calls from adults, 2 in South Africa and another one from Europe, targeted by these criminal groups. So I think it is, firstly, is to recognize that, man, what you are going through right now is unimaginable, and but you are not alone,
Mhm.
and it's knowing that there are vast, there are likely countless other people experiencing that
Mhm.
right now, and it's to come forward. It's reaching out to somebody that you trust, and maybe
Mhm.
somebody in law enforcement that could provide assistance. We know that there's a hotline to the National Center of
Mhm.
Missing and Exploited Children. Reach out to people. This is not an anomaly. You are not alone, and there are definitely people on standby that want to help,
Mhm.
and that have the understanding of how sensitive this is. And yeah,
Yeah, and I'll add on to that too, because you mentioned the NCMEC hotline, which we'll make sure to include in our
yeah,
show notes. They also have a really incredible tool called Take It Down, which helps if
yeah,
you are under the age of 18,
yeah,
they help you remove images if they've been
yeah.
shared online already. NCMEC does involve primarily minors.
Mm.
One other resource that we'll make sure to put in the show notes is the Civil
Helpline.
Rights Initiative, and
Exactly.
they help adults, and they also have a confidential hotline
Yeah.
as well. So that's a
Yeah,
great
yeah. I think just
resource.
people knowing that you're not alone.
Mhm.
You don't have to walk this journey on your own, because it is incredibly lonely. It is
Mhm.
incredibly fear-inducing, and I think the sooner you can reach out for help, the better.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as always, as we're looking for that mass scale prevention element, I do think it's so helpful to kind of
Mm.
break out this organized criminal element of sextortion, because it just does open up ideas for solutions at the governmental
Oh
level,
yeah.
what tech can be doing better, even how the
Mm.
NGO community can step in.
Yeah.
So thank you, Marcel, so
Yeah.
much for helping us shine a light on this. Do you have
Mm.
any kind of final
Yeah, I
thoughts?
think
Yeah.
I think we also had conversations internally about the US trafficking persons report,
Yeah.
right? Where the issue of sextortion has been mentioned,
Hmm.
albeit fleetingly, as a mechanism through which trafficking victims or trafficking occurs. So I do think that there is a huge opportunity, whether you are a researcher listening to
Hmm.
this, um, a law enforcement officer, maybe even people in federal government, that it's critically important that the issue of sextortion is recognized as a key an emerging crime that really deserve to be elevated. So
Mhm.
part of our conversation is, how can we elevate the issue of sextortion within the annual trafficking persons report?
Mhm.
So I think Nkosi is definitely veering into that space. And also, I mean, we started having conversations internally about the issue of organized crime and the work we do around the web of sexual
Mhm.
exploitation. So we're definitely looking into how do we recognize and elevate the connection between organized crime and the web of sexual
Mhm.
exploitation. So we are definitely in that arena, and we are actively looking into how do we elevate this issue and really give it the credence that it deserves.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Marcel, so much for helping us to do that.
Mm,
And I know that this conversation is really informative to me. I know
mm,
that we do have a former blog and a webinar that we did about a year ago now on the
mm.
issue of sextortion, where we talked about it as one of the largest blackmail operations in
Oh
human
yeah.
history. So we'll make sure to include that show note, and then also show
Mm,
notes to some of these resources.
mm.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us in this conversation. It won't be the last time that we're talking about this
Yeah.
topic. In fact, I know actually of a couple topics coming up ahead where the organized crime element will definitely want to be pulling in as we
Mm,
look at different dots on the web of
mm.
sexual exploitation.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you,
So
Aileen.
thank you so
Mm,
much. And thank you all so much for
yeah.
joining. Please make sure to listen, like, share, subscribe, add a comment, add a question. And thank you all so much for joining us in Ending Sexploitation.